We start with a piece of wood that's been sanded to the best possible finish that you can put on it. I've sanded that through 400 and it is smooth as I could possibly get it. So the first step that I'm going to do here is to wet the surface with a damp cloth. Now by damp cloth, I mean one that I have saturated with water and then wrung it out totally. That is now damp. Okay, wipe the surface. This will raise any grain that's been compacted from the sanding, and then I'm going back and sand it again with the last grit that was used. Now the secret to doing this is to make sure that it's totally dry, not just surface dry, but deep dry, totally dry. I'm going to cheat on the overnight wait and use the heat gun here to dry the surface of the wood. I'm not going to let it get so hot that I can't touch it. Now I can come back and sand it with 400 again. Instead of waiting overnight, I took 10 minutes. I only want to sand enough to take the fuzz off the wood. I don't want to actually get down and cut into new wood again, otherwise I'll have to do the wetting all over again. I want to be able to wet that surface without the grain raising. Now I'm going to take my same damp cloth and wipe it over the surface of the wood. One of the perils of doing this is that I raise the grain again when I put that moisture on the second time. This one did that, so I'm going to have to let that dry again. And then hit it with the 400. It's important that we get that grain all fuzzed up and sanded back down. Otherwise, as soon as we put the dye on it, it's going to snap right back up again. Let's do this one more time. Only this time I'm not going to let it dry. All that does is wet the surface of the wood and lets that water-soluble dye run out a little bit easier. The dye I'm using is a water-soluble aniline dye. My preference for water-soluble is that it's more color-fast than the alcohol or oil-soluble dyes. I've mixed this myself from the packets of powder, and I use about twice as much as what would normally be called for in the instructions. That's just a personal preference. So while that wood is still moist, let's just put this dye on. You know, I just thought of something. I'm supposed to be dyeing this thing black. Not to worry, the blue is on purpose. Black dye left by itself on the wood will have a tendency to form a bronze color on the surface. To prevent that bronzing, we need to color correct it. So I am using the blue for that. That will make sure that there's no bronze on the surface of the wood. So there is a purpose behind that blue. I'm going to keep rotating that just a little bit to prevent it all from running down to the bottom. And once it's started to dry a little bit, I'm going to let it sit overnight. Okay, that's nice and dry. And now the next thing that we're going to do is burnish it with the paper towel. All that does is remove the excess off. Now we could go on and put another coat of blue on it if we wanted to and make it a nice dark blue, but I'm going to use the black just like we originally intended. First coat of black. I'm using these little foam throwaway brushes, except I don't throw them away. I rinse them out, let them dry out, and keep them. Then that's our first coat of black. Get the rim. The rim's going to, that's a lot of end grain open there. This one I'm doing the back as well. Make sure you get a couple of coats on it and get it soaked in there really good. Now it is definitely black. Just keep rotating it a little bit, prevent all of that from running down. Now you can either let this wait until the next day, or again use the dryer. If you're going to use a dryer or a heat gun, just apply it a little bit, don't let it get too hot, and get the wet look away from it until it starts to turn a flat black. And then I would let it sit for about an hour, just to make sure that it's thoroughly dry. Well, it's now been an hour, so I'm going to run the lathe, and I'm going to burnish it with a paper towel, just like I did with all the other. See, what that does is just get rid of all of the loose stuff that's accumulated on the surface. Stop it and do that center by hand, because there's no velocity there in the middle as you go by. If you look in here real close, you probably can't see it there. There's some little white flecks in there. I'm going to give it one more application of the black. So this is the second black that it's getting. Now, if I were using a red dye or a green maybe, I would want to bleach the wood first, because the red dye is a little more transparent and the color of the wood tends to come through. Keep the thing spinning. Don't let it sit too long and get too hot in one place, or you're going to warp that piece of wood. Might warp it permanently. Okay, that is dry and it feels dry, but I'm going to let it sit for an hour just to make sure that it's dry down inside the wood and not just on the surface. Now that is dry. I dried that with the heat gun and it sat for about an hour. And then I'm going to burnish it with a paper towel. And stop it and rub that center by hand. You should start to see a little bit of gloss coming up on it now.